And now I am happy to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Cindy Haynes, and Dr. Haynes is a professor of horticulture and CELT faculty fellow at Iowa State University in Ames. Her primary responsibilities are in teaching and extension. She teaches several courses for the Department of Horticulture and for the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. She also has extension responsibilities in consumer or home horticulture and is on the advisory board for the Master Gardener program in Iowa. So welcome, Cindy. Thank you for being here with us this evening, and I will let you take over the presentation.
Oh, that's a little bit scary and letting me take over the presentation. Thank you so much for everyone who is here. I appreciate this opportunity. I also appreciate the opportunity to speak in place of someone else. I know you had originally registered for this for someone else who could not be with us tonight, and I will do my best to honor a lot of what she was supposed to talk about and hopefully answer some of your questions so that you get better at starting seed, all kinds of seed. I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're talking a little bit about a slightly different topic. It's not going to be focused entirely on native prairie plants, but seed starting is seed starting, and that will include a lot of different things tonight with me talking about this. So don't freak out by seeing oranges on the screen. We will get to oranges for something in just a little bit. I am talking seed today, and I love seed. I love starting seed. There's a lot of diversity in seed. This is a diversity of seed that you might see in growing trees, woody plants, many of these from the Midwest and even some from a little bit parts further south as well. We get a lot of different types of seeds, and seeds look different. Depending on the species, they have evolved based on their environment and how they will disperse. So seeds are kind of fascinating when you think about it. And every seed's just a little bit different. Regardless of how seeds look or how they are dispersed, they have some of the same parts. They have some of the same functions. The seed is that prepackaged plant that is supposed to grow and develop into whatever that species is, whether it's a grass, like the corn seed on the left, or it's a eudicot or a dicot like the bean seed on the right. There's still some very basic parts that all of them have. And I will say that all of them have some sort of seed coat or protective covering. All of them have a little baby embryo kind of in the center that will develop into that seedling and mature plant eventually. And then there's some sort of food source, like an endosperm or a cotyledon that provides that fuel for the germination process. Today, my objective is to talk to you a little bit about these 4 different areas. So when we're talking about seed, we're going to talk a little bit about how to collect seed and cleaning. This becomes really important in native collecting of seeds, particularly some of those prairie species. We're going to talk a little bit about the dormancy requirement of any kind of seed that we collect from the wild, especially in temperate areas. We'll have to discuss for a little bit those environmental conditions, because germinating seeds indoors or even outdoors, you have to be aware of those environmental conditions and how they can impact germination. And then we'll talk a little bit about storage of extra seed, or if you save seeds and continue this cycle again. So let's dive right in and let's talk a little bit about something that we're really good at in the Midwest and in Iowa in particular, is collecting some seeds, particularly of some of these kind of prairie plants or more natives plants. So here's some seed collection tips that I really want you to consider. First off, if you are collecting seed from anywhere, whether it's in the Midwest, in Iowa, or anywhere else in the US, know that if you're collecting seed from a site that you or property that you don't own, you need to make sure you have permission. So some public lands require permits before you're collecting any kind of plant part, including seeds. And some just say, okay, as long as you let us know. So making sure that you have those permissions can be fairly important. This is important because some species tend to be a little less popular, that maybe don't produce as much seed as others. So we want to make sure that that population that exists there is healthy and thriving first before we start kind of collecting seeds. So this is a good conservation practice, and a nice thing to do. You can also think about collecting seed with groups of people, conservation boards, other kind of prairie groups that kind of go out together, and they usually make sure that they have these kind of permissions in place ahead of time. Once you have the permission, then the timing is pretty important. Most native plants will develop their seed so many weeks after flowering. And that varies a lot from species to species. So you want to make sure it's ripe and ready, that that seed is mature. Harvesting immature seed usually reduces the viability in your germination rates. So making sure that it's viable and it's ready to harvest is a very important aspect of this. This timing varies with species. This is an aster in this particular picture, and you can see in this aster these tiny little dark seeds, usually with prairie plant or perennial natives. The seed turn kind of a darker in color, and they start to dry down just a little bit. And then it has all this kind of fluff or appendage that helps it kind of fly for dispersal. So you're looking for some of that drier fluff that will fly easy, and then it kind of separates the seed easily as well. So figuring out that maturity is pretty important. Most plants that we harvest from the garden, we're harvesting by hand. This is a great idea because every species is a little different. There are mechanical ways to harvest large swaths of seed, but then it often mixes multiple species together. And if you want to grow more aster, then you want to harvest the aster, and you don't want any goldenrod in necessarily with it. So making sure you do this by hand, making sure you know which ones you want. The other advantage of doing this is that you can then select the ones that maybe have the color of bloom that you want, or that may be the stature that you want. So you can actually select the ones, if you have a lot, that you like from the plants that you like the best. That's applying a little bit of selection pressure, but it also is a way to assure that you might get more of what you like about this particular species. When you're collecting, we often put them in a type of bag that is breathable, that will dry really well. So sometimes this is as simple as the paper grocery bag or paper lunch sack. Those will work really well. There's mesh bags that you can use, and even these really fine jewelry bags work really well. So think about, because there might be some more drying that needs to happen in this process. After you've collected the seed, you need to clean it. Most seed, whether it's vegetable seed, annual flower seed, woody plant seed, or perennial natives, they have a lot of extra with them. So this extra is important in seed dispersal, but it may not be necessary or needed for the germination process. It makes them identifiable, but it somehow, if you can get rid of at least some of that debris, it's great organic matter you can use elsewhere, but it kind of defines the seed itself. This means you're going to have to look really closely sometimes to know what is the seed and what is the chaff, and that you want to eliminate. There's lots of ways of doing this on walks through the prairie. When we collect different seeds, we let them dry a little bit. Then we often have different methods for removing that chaff based on what the plant actually is. And sometimes it seems a little rough. So we might use a mortar and pestle so that we can actually kind of break up this extra chaff and remove it. Sometimes it's as simple as just kind of crushing it in your hands so that you can separate. Sometimes you can put these through screens. These are some really nice screens that you can kind of seed things through. You can even use colanders and other kind of things to kind of filter some of this through as well. Winnowing is kind of pouring some of this seed and having a fan blowing the excess off. And if you have a heavier seed that won't be blown, so then you're separating once again the seed itself from the chaff. And works well for some species, not everything. I should also mention that when we're talking about seed cleaning, sometimes that process is a wet process. So if we're not talking about necessarily perennial natives or perennial plants, we're talking tomatoes. If we're talking some tree fruits, some woody plants, they produce seed inside something that stays fairly fleshy. And processing that and cleaning it up to get to the seed often is a wet processing process. So we're putting it in a bucket with water. We're letting the seeds sink that we know are viable, removing those that float, or removing the fruit that float because they probably have a lot of air pockets in them. We might even it may also be really important in allowing some of those seeds to ferment a little bit so that we can separate the seed from all this excess juice as it kind of softens. It's a little smelly, not always the easiest work, but it makes it easier in separating the seed from all the excess so that we get it and that we're storing or germinating the seed itself. So when we're collecting seed, there are a lot of videos, and throughout this presentation, I'll share some videos with you, or at least some video links with you. You'll have access to this presentation again as well. There's a lot of really wonderful videos on how to collect and clean seed of native prairie plants that I really want you to watch. There's one from the Nebraska Pheasants Forever that does a really good job of sieving some of the seed through different sieves so that you have different grades and different cleanliness of some of the seeds, even dry. It's amazing how good they do that. They even have some kind of tricks on how to dry some seed down. I also like this one called Seed Collecting for Midwest Prairie Plants. It's a lot of fun because they do a really good job of showing you kind of native prairie plants and what they're harvesting, so you get a good ID features in that process and collecting some of those different things. I will say, however, on this one, it's a little bit of a PG video because he does cuss a little bit when he talks about take them and put them in a bag, because everything he talks about is taking and putting them in the bag. So you're now warned a little bit about that one. So the process has been discussed. We've talked about collecting the seed. We've talked about cleaning the seed. Then we have to kind of think about our expectations and what we're going to do with this seed. So depending on the type of seed that you're collecting, it may or may not be true to type. And true to type means that seedling will look like and be identical in a sense to that parent plant that you collected it from. And you know this. You know that you can't always harvest the seed from an apple, a Honeycrisp apple, or a Jonagold apple, or Golden Delicious apple, and know that the seeds, and if you germinate those seeds, that they're going to produce that Honeycrisp, that Jonagold, or that Golden Delicious apple. The apples will still be apples, but they might look a lot different, for better or for worse. With some prairie seed, with some other native seed, it tends to be a little more true to type. So, but with hybrid seed, it tends to not be true to type. So knowing that going forward is pretty important in managing your expectations and what you're growing. You can also purchase seed. You don't have to collect seed. You can purchase seed from different places. Even native prairie seed, you can check with your county conservation board. They might even have some seed giveaways or seed swaps. There's lots of places that you can get seed, maybe without collecting, that all often come in good, kind of clean, ready to sow shape. I wanted to mention that seed is often sold in different ways or manners. This is pelleted seed. It is seed that tends to be really small and very difficult to handle, even with kind of fine motor skills. They will kind of run it through a biodegradable coating machine so that it has a little bit of this, makes the seed a little bit larger, easier to handle so that you can directly sow one seed. We do this a lot with annuals and annual flowers and some vegetables that make it a little bit easier to sow, especially if you're starting these seeds indoors. So petunias, which tend to be fairly fine seed, might be pelleted, and you can buy them at different places, pelleted seed. This is a little more expensive, but like I said, it makes it a lot easier to sow and often a little bit easier to transplant because you've got better spacing, and you often do a better job. So usually kind of pays for itself in better quality seedlings as well. Some seed is detailed. So what we were doing with the Cosmos in that video before was removing that excess, that tail of information or excess debris. So that's just a cleaned seed so that any appendages have been removed. Some seed are in clusters, so there's not one individual seed. Beet seed has this tendency to be in clusters, so they look kind of odd shaped, and it's often several seed kind of together, and there's no real way to break them apart. It's just sowing the cluster and then thinning later. You can also buy prime seed for some things. It's already been started. They tend to be a little more expensive, but it's a great way to assure with some seed that you're getting seed that will germinate readily. And then the last one I'll mention is this treated seed. Sometimes seed are treated with a fungicide, kind of a powder on the fungicide on the outside of the seed. And it's usually noted on the seed package that you're getting treated seed. It usually is a very bright, kind of almost obnoxious color, a fuchsia pink or a teal blue green or bright purple seed. And what this tells you, even if you don't buy the treated seed, that it tells you that this particular species may have problems with fungal pathogens during germination. So we wouldn't go through this extra effort of treating that seed with a fungicide to prevent fungal pathogens unless it was common. So something to think about. The seed packet gives you a lot of information. Please don't discount that. Read it really carefully. It gives you information on how to grow it, what conditions it might need to improve germination. So on this particular packet, you can see it talks about 8 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks of cold, wet kind of stratification to make sure that this seed will germinate. It will also tell you that it may take 2 years for the seedling after germination to reach a certain height and maybe flower. So there's a lot of information on a seed packet, including when's the best time to sow it for your particular area. Okay, so we've kind of gone over some of the basics of maybe collecting seed, maybe preparing that seed. Before we actually get into the germination process, with seed that you've collected in the wild, I have to mention dormancy. wild collected temperate seed, whether it's woody plants or perennial plants, often have this dormancy requirement. And the dormancy can be one of two different types. It could be a physiological dormancy, an embryo that's not quite ready, that's waiting for winter to happen, or it could be a physical dormancy, a super hard seed coat that's preventing germination from happening as well. So these are kind of physiological or morphological as well as mechanical dormancies or inhibitors to prevent germination. And you need to address that with many of these temperate seed before starting. The first one I wanted to mention and showcase is stratification, because that's essentially giving these seeds a mock winter. We can do this indoors. We can also do this outdoors by planting the seed outdoors in the fall. And I'll mention a little bit about that at the end. But we often do this with different tree seeds or different perennial seed indoors by giving them this kind of cool, moist environment. And in this particular image, the amount of these cool, moist environment varies with species, but almost always is at least a month, maybe a month and a half, all the way up to maybe 3 months of this kind of cool, moist temperature. The other things I want you to remember about this is the cool, moist temperature needs to be like your refrigerator. So it needs to be above freezing and usually below 40, 45 degrees. So we're looking at this 35 to 40 degree temperature as considered the ideal. So putting seed in a freezer isn't getting you anywhere for stratification. So it's about the amount of time that the seed is at this kind of 35 degree temperature. It greatly increases germination. So you can see in this slide, there's no germination for the first month, month and a half. And then after that, you're up to 80% germination just from the fact that you've had it in this kind of refrigerated environment. Is it just this cool, moist environment? No. Different species don't necessarily read our books, and it's not as easy as giving every temperate species the same amount of stratification. Every species is a little bit different. Some require a warm condition first, and then may require 2 kind of cool conditions afterwards, which means another warm condition or stratification in between. This example is peony, and it does require a little bit of a warm stratification first to initiate kind of a radical and to elongate a little bit of that embryo, and then it stops. It waits for a cold stratification period before any shoot starts to emerge. And in fact, sometimes it may even take 2 cold stratifications before that seed germinates. So this is a way that it's ensuring that it has the right conditions, that it's bypassed winter, but it's started just a little bit and it's waiting for those right conditions. So that embryo knows that those conditions need to be met before it's actually going to fully germinate. You can do this in your refrigerator. Your refrigerator is the ideal environment. It's a little weird having a baggie of soil with seeds in it in your refrigerator, but it works actually pretty well. You're looking once again for this cool 35 to 40 degrees in temperature. You want to keep the seed moist. So usually having this in a Ziploc bag is great. And then you want to put it in there for anywhere from 1 to 3 months. I'm hoping that you'll research what you're growing and what you're stratifying so you will know if it takes 6 weeks or if it's going to take 12 weeks. I would say with most trees, you're going to go to the 12-week time frame. With most perennials, you're going to be in the 6 to 8 weeks at a minimum. to make sure that you have good germination afterwards. Do you have to do this in soil? No, you will see some people that will stratify with just moist paper towels. You also see some people that will stratify. They will sow their seeds in soil in the containers that they're going to grow them in and put them in the refrigerator and then take them out when ready. It's up to you as to what method you prefer and works well for you. It's about getting that time at the right temperature. Stratification is another part of the dormancy requirement for some seed, and this has evolved a little bit differently. Scarification, evolved when there were some kind of connections between seed and plants and animals. And this is a great example of this. There is a tree, the Tambalocoing tree. I'm not sure if I said that correctly, and the dodo bird. When the dodo bird went extinct, the tree started to decline because apparently this particular bird ate this particular seed. This particular bird had the right type of gizzard that would actually roughen up the super hard seed coat. And then when it was pooped out, it had instant fertilizer, the seed coat was all broken up, and then the seed would actually germinate. And very few other birds could do this as well as the dodo bird. So scarification is about breaking up that really hard seed coat and making sure that air and water and other things, kind of temperatures, kind of starts this germination process. So it's pretty obvious that we're not going to eat our seeds so that we can poop them out and try and scarify them that way. But I would like you to think about, for those of you who've done this technique before, how do you scarify seeds? Once again, it's about nicking or damaging that seed coat. Now, this is tricky because you want to damage the seed coat without damaging the embryo. So you just want to get access to this. So you're not going to actually destroy the seed in the process. A rock tumbler works really well for those really hard seed coats. Be careful with the hammer. Make sure, once again, you're not actually destroying the embryo. And boiling water is another aspect. So here's some of the ways that you can scarify seeds. It's important that it's the seed that you're scarifying. So you're taking the seed and rubbing it on the file or the sandpaper, that the seed is large enough for you to hold and try and nick. You have to be careful with this because you can also slice a finger a little bit as well. Sometimes we even take seeds and put them in a rock tumbler and kind of break them up that way with rocks so that we can kind of just make a little bit of a damage to that outer seed coat. Hot water works really well too. In nature, fire is another method. I don't recommend fire, but hot water, boiling hot water in a coffee mug overnight works really well for morning glory seeds or any other member of that Ipomea genus. In horticulture, as professionals, we might also use acid. Believe it or not, sulfuric acid. And if you want to punch holes in yucca seed, which is really hard seed, it's 30 minutes and sitting in sulfuric acid. And that won't damage the seed. It just punches holes into the seed coat. But that's tough for most home gardeners. You don't have the place to deal with sulfuric acid. So instead, just think of hot water. Think about that rock tumbler. Think about those places that you can kind of maybe put it in between some sandpaper. All you need is to get one little opening. That's it. And you've got it. What are some examples of seeds that need scarification? It's those hard seeds. Eastern redbud is one that we have in this area that's a small seed that needs scarification. Some other things like the yucca that we were talking about, a few other things. There are some videos in here that I want to show you about this process. this can be intimidating to think about how you're damaging seeds without damaging the embryo, or stratifying seeds and how long that will take. But you can check out some of these videos and they do a pretty good job of explaining this process, because this is our ultimate goal, is to actually have something kind of germinating and starting and having a good success with, 75% germinating or better. I will mention that there are some plants that require both of these. They might need to be scarified as well as stratified. Scarification almost always has to come first before stratification. And then there are some seeds like Trillium that will need to be stratified multiple times. So we have a cold stratification and then a warm stratification and then a cold stratification again. So in nature, these will take a couple years to actually germinate. Can you let Mother Nature do this? Absolutely. You just have to be able to mark that spot and that seedbed and know that this is going to happen. So let's take 10 minutes, 5 minutes or less, and talk a little bit about those environmental conditions that are required for germinating seed. This works for any seed, tree seed, vegetable seed, flower seed, prairie seed, doesn't matter. The environmental conditions are pretty important. And to do it well, we have the best control in growing things indoors. You can start some seed outdoors as well, but you're at the whim of Mother Nature, right? Which usually happens if you're patient, but do realize that you lose a little bit of control over this process. Whether it's indoors or outdoors is also species dependent. Sunflowers always germinate better for me when I sow them directly outdoors than trying to sow them inside. Sometimes that seed packet will give you that information as to which would be most successful. You can start with a bunch of supplies. You can spend a lot of money on this, or you can spend a little bit of money on this. What I'm going to tell you is start off with good, clean supplies, at least initially. Start out with good, viable seed. So don't work with a really old seed unless you know it has been stored very well. You might even think about investing in things like a heat mat, a sprayer that's a super fine mist, and then ways to kind of catalog or keep track of what you're actually growing. The containers don't have to be fancy. I love doing seed starting with kids and kind of those cardboard egg containers or making paper pots. But think about what you're growing. Tree seed will take a little bit longer to germinate, maybe to get big enough to plant outside. So these paper pots may not last long enough. So there I might recycle some plastic pots for those particular things. But zinnias, these are great. So think about what you're growing, how long they're going to be in this, because sometimes these biodegradable containers don't last very long on purpose. And then there's some really good biodegradable containers that will last for a couple of years. So that's a good idea to kind of investigate some different types of containers. You can be a little flexible on the containers. I'm going to tell you to be a little less flexible, to be picky on the germination mix. You want a good germination mix. You want a fine germination mix. So you want something that your seed doesn't just fall into the depths of what you're actually have it, whether it's a plug tray or a seed kind of tray like this. So a good sterile germination mix really makes the difference. Very important. And this is different than your typical potting mix because it's finer and won't allow some of that kind of seed to filter too far into it. So spend some money on the germination mix. You also probably want to spend some money at least on monitoring that soil temperature. Seed germinates quickly if it's at the proper soil temperature. And that really depends on what you're growing. Different species have different temperature requirements. This is a vegetable, list. But notice that the pepper down here will germinate in about 25 days, 3 to 4 weeks, when it's at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But at about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, it can probably germinate in a week or less, or about a week. So the amount of time that it takes for it to germinate often depends on the soil temperature. Having a heat mat is a great way to ensure that soil temperatures. Many of these have a kind of probe that you can actually put into the soil, and some of them even have a way to kind of maintain certain temperatures. So you have a thermocouple, you have a heat mat that's water resistant, so it's made for this. It's not a heating pad, not your typical heating pad, and then can kind of maintain this temperature that you need to germinate these seeds and germinate them. You also want to make sure it stays fairly humid. This often means having a kind of a cover over this. You don't have to spend a lot of money on these kind of greenhouse containers. You can just put a Ziploc bag over some seed and kind of keep that humidity up. Anything to kind of keep the humidity at a high enough level to help keep those seed from drying out. Or regular kind of misting is another possibility here. Some seed are very particular. This is orchid seeds. Orchid seeds are super fine, and many of them have little to no endosperm, so there's no kind of food supply for germination. So that 1 in a million seed will land in the right place that has enough moisture and food supply so that it can actually germinate and survive. This is why we now grow a lot of orchid seed on agar in kind of sterile conditions, and it's amazing the number that will actually germinate, and we can kind of propagate from this particular method. It's really fantastic. You also need to think about how you're going to water seed. Seed are very sensitive and don't like big explosions of water. So especially as they're starting to germinate or before they've started to germinate, a big blast of water might move all the seed to one end of the tray. And sometimes we want to make sure that they have consistent moisture, but not too wet, not too dry. So watering techniques are kind of critical with seeds. Sometimes you can water from below. So you can place the seed tray in a mat, let it sit there in that saucer for an hour or two until the whole seed soil profile is moist, and take it out. They have these interesting kind of bulb waterers that are super fine and gentle watering wands. And then there's even misters that you can buy. So instead of your regular breaker, you can buy this kind of brass mister that has a super fine water spray, so it's not going to damage or move any of your seed. With water, it's also important not to apply too much. Seed are pretty sensitive to something called damping off. This is a fungal pathogen. This is why some seed are treated to prevent this from happening if possible. But if it stays too wet, any seed are likely to damp off and die. And you know it's damping off because it happens very suddenly. All of the seed will kind of die at the soil line very quickly, usually within 24 to 48 hours of one another. Starting with clean pots and trays, sterile, good germination media, and not overwatering are 3 things that you can do to kind of prevent this from happening. And then light. Is light needed for germination? Not for all species. And so you've got the first week off where you don't necessarily have to have a lot of light, but light is essential once germination happens for growth. And we want seedlings to have really compact growth. So we want our light source to be really close to the plant. and as intense as we possibly can. And it doesn't matter if it's an LED light or a fluorescent light. Both of those work pretty well. I would say avoid an incandescent light, but it's becoming hard to find incandescent lights anymore anyway. Incandescent lights are less efficient and they produce too much heat. And that becomes a problem for seedlings when they're really close to the plant. This is what you're looking for, seed trays where everything's kind of lined up. It's nicely labeled. The light is pretty close. They're pretty stocky and compact. You can also do this with a fan, making sure there's kind of a fan over this as well to help keep that kind of thickening of the stem as well. And then these are staying moist, but not wet. And all of these were actually watered from below. So we kept the foliage dry. So regardless of what you do, acclimation is important. So make sure before you put anything that you started inside, make sure you've acclimated them slowly to outdoor conditions, because a lot of the seedlings that were grown inside never experienced wind. And that can be a big issue, even if you've had fans on them. And the light outside is way more intense than inside. You can start some seed outside, and we do this a lot with some temperate plants and let Mother Nature kind of do the stratification for us. If you're going to do this outside, I would say prepare a good seed bed with really good fine soil so it's not dropping out, filtering down too far. Label it really well, protect it from animals and birds. And then think about the timing as well. If it's temperate seed that requires some stratification, maybe sow it in the fall so that that process happens. And then think about how are you going to deal with it afterwards as well? Because once the seed starts to emerge outside, you're going to have some weeds that emerge with it. So you're going to have to know what that seedling looks like and what do the weeds look like so you can do some weeding. Those are some kind of seed saving tips and how to kind of get the best out of that. I will say storage of some of these different seeds does require usually airtight containers. So if you're storing vegetable seeds or annual seeds from year to year, the viability greatly is reduced if you are not storing them in the proper conditions. So you can look this up. But most seeds, you're thinking about a cool, dry, dark place. So airtight containers are usually best. And then you can run some viability tests too. So think about maybe doing a germination test on seeds that you've had for a year or more before you actually germinate them so that you know if the germination percentage has been reduced. Some things like corn, even in the proper storage conditions, they're only going to last a couple of years. So having fresh seed every year is the best way to kind of make sure that you have good viability and you store them well. And then seed are weird. Just when we do everything correct, there are some weird seed out there that do something we don't think about. Some seed, like some oranges and Kentucky bluegrass, believe it or not, have apomictic seed. So when I say that it's not necessarily true to type, apomictic seed are seed that form from the maternal tissues and are genetically identical to that tissue that it was from. So it doesn't go through that fertilization process. So you might not get the same thing with apples, but if you want to try oranges or the little oranges, you may get the exact same plant as well, especially if it's apomictic. Last thing I'm going to show you, and you're going to be able to kind of go back and look at some of this later, are some of the resources on seed propagation. There's a lot of resources out there. The Tallgrass Prairie Center gives you a lot of information on prairie plants. The Ball Culture Guide will give you a lot of information on sowing seed for annuals, and maybe even some vegetables as well. And then the New England Wildflower Society has a really great book that talks about different wildflowers and how to propagate them. So you can find a lot of information if you just look for some different books. You can also visit a lot of websites, Iowa State University, the Natural Resources and Ecology Management webpage. This one's a great place to check out for a link to other places when talking about prairie plantings, ISU Yard and Garden for starting seed for like annuals and vegetables. And then there's probably someplace near you that does this, that it's an arboretum, that's the Iowa Prairie Network or a conservation board that has some of this knowledge on how to start seeds in your area. So look a little bit to see if you can find those things. And then last but not least, don't forget some of these seed companies. They're great at this as well. We have a few in Iowa or the Midwest listed at top. There's also a bunch of other kind of seed locations that you can buy annual and vegetable and cut flower seeds from these at the ISU FAQ, Yard and Garden FAQ websites. And I don't want to exclude trees because there's some great tree resources as well. And this is a fun one in Massachusetts where you can buy a lot of seeds of a lot of different trees. And now I'm done. And I am only having a little bit of time for questions, but I don't mind. I had so much fun talking about seed. Yes, some people are putting in some nice things in the chat. Alicia, what are some of the questions that I have?
Yes, we don't have a lot of time for questions. We're going to answer the biggest ones, which this is one I always wondered about too. What happens to seeds that are being stratified if they freeze? Say if you put them in too cool of an area, or if they're stratifying outside and they freeze.
So a lot of what's happening in this embryo is there's some hormones that are kind of managing time or knocking off time. So they know that they've had this many chilling hours of different things. So when it freezes, it all stops. So the clock stops. So you're not getting that stratification temperature that you need, and it's not knocking off that time that needs to germination. So too cold, too warm, knocks off time or stops time. So think of it that way.
Great. I am also going to share my screen while we're answering these last couple questions. We do have a survey here that's only 4 questions long. It's very short, so if anyone feels so compelled to complete the survey, it really greatly helps us in just making sure that we're offering things that are valuable to all of you. And the next question, can you just go over the main points again about how we know if a seed is mature enough to be harvested from a plant?
Right. Usually maturity means it's ripe and ready. So we know a seed is ready to be harvested from a tomato when a tomato is red, all right, or whatever color it should be. We know a seed is ready to harvest from a prairie plant, usually when that seed head kind of is dry and ready to disperse. So think of it that way. Maybe it's something that flies away. So, or maybe it's something that explodes as it opens up. So keep checking and you will see this. Usually with the dry type seeds, they're not very moist. They will get dry and they will get pretty dry, or you can harvest them and let them dry down a little bit more. And with the moist seeds like trees, like crab apples or tomatoes, they're fully mature and are just about ready to crack and be beyond it. That's when you harvest seed from them. We know that they're fully mature.
Okay, great. And then one last question. When we say moist stratification, are we talking about moistening the seeds before we put them in there? And along with that, questions about soilless mix. What does that mean? What's a good thing to look for in a germination soil mix?
Right. So the soilless mix, when we're talking about moist stratification, that means we're putting this seed in moist soil in that Ziploc bag in the refrigerator, or we're putting it in a Ziploc bag with a moist paper towel. So it's high humidity. It's usually not dry. And in fact, we don't want it to be moldy, but it's not unusual to see some mold maybe in this, is staying that moist. And what are we looking for in this kind of good seed germination mix? It's very organic. It tends to be fairly light because it has maybe a lot of that perlite in it. So it stays well drained, so it's not going to damp off so easily for you. And I will tell you, it won't be cheap. So that's another good thing to look for because it's a good soilless mix. Doesn't contain any garden soil. It's mostly just peat moss or wire or core coconut husk, as well as these other things like perlite, the white stuff that makes it very well drained. And it usually starts out fairly sterile and clean. So it's not bringing any herbicides, it's not bringing any pathogens that you might be bringing from outdoors.